The Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Matthew.
Glory to you, Lord.
Peter approached Jesus and asked him, "Lord, if my brother sins against me, how often must I forgive? As many as 7 times?" Jesus answered, "I say to you, not 7 times, but 77 times. That is why the kingdom of heaven may be likened to a king who decided to settle accounts with his servants. When he began the accounting, a debtor was brought before him who owed him a huge amount. Since he had no way of paying it back, his master ordered him to be sold, along with his wife, his children, and all his property, in payment of the debt. At that, the servant fell down, did him homage, and said, 'Be patient with me, and I will pay you back in full.' Moved with compassion, the master of that servant let him go and forgave him the loan. When that servant had left, he found one of his fellow servants who owed him a much smaller amount. He seized him and started to choke him, demanding, 'Pay back what you owe.' Falling to his knees, his fellow servant begged him, 'Be patient with me, and I will pay you back.' But he refused. Instead, he had the fellow servant put in prison until he paid back the debt. Now, when his fellow servants saw what had happened, they were deeply disturbed and went to their master and reported the whole affair. His master summoned him and said to him, 'You wicked servant, I forgave you your entire debt because you begged me to. Should you not have had pity on your fellow servant as I had pity on you?' Then in anger, his master handed him over to the torturers until he should pay back the whole debt. So will my heavenly Father do to you, unless each of you forgives your brother from your heart." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
With all due respect to Jimmy Fallon and Jimmy Kimmel and Stephen Colbert, my favorite late-night talk show host is David Letterman. I know he's retired now. He does his show now on Netflix. But for my money, he was the best in the business. And what made him the best was the creative ways he would create these bits that would make us all laugh. Stupid human tricks, stupid pet tricks, the top 10 list. When Monsignor Tom asked me to come to do this healing mission, he asked that I might concentrate on forgiveness. So I thought for my first homily, I would concentrate on ourselves and why we need to be more forgiving. And I further thought that I'd take the liberty of borrowing from the Letterman show and use the top 10 list as my vehicle. So bear with me as I present to you the top 10 reasons why we need to be more forgiving. In Letterman fashion, I begin with 10, work my way down to 1. 10th reason why we need to be forgiving is because our failure to do so can have epic repercussions. I attended a Parliament of World Religions several years ago in Chicago. The entire week was an effort to forge some common ground amongst the 10 world religions and to come up with ways to work together for the common good. One of the plenary sessions we had was called the Voices of the Dispossessed. And people representing areas of the world where human rights were being violated, where injustice and persecution and torture was rampant. Representatives from those areas and those peoples, they were invited to speak. Well, everything went smoothly until someone from Kashmir came up to speak. And suddenly there were all kinds of shouts coming from the audience. It's kind of scary. It subsided, and somebody from the Sikh religion came up and talked about the persecution of people of the Sikh religion, and all of a sudden, more shouting came up. My God, we were all getting kind of nervous. Then finally, the Native Americans jumped up and went and did kind of a peace dance and calmed everybody down. It was obvious from the shouts that there was a different perspective on things in Kashmir, a different perspective on goings on with the Sikh people. And so I queried amongst my friends as to what was that all about. And they proceeded to tell me that those disputing parties have been at each other's throats for centuries. That there's been this bad blood between them for a long, long time. We felt some of that in the audience. And the bad thing about it, that person told me, was it probably all started when one family did something wrong to another family, and they never, ever tried to reconcile or try to forgive each other. And as is often the case when that happens, things escalate from there. Acrimony and hatred and anger continues to fester, and all of a sudden a full-blown feud comes up involving thousands upon thousands of people. It was Dominic Henry Perez, who won the Nobel Prize back in '58, who famously said many years ago that if an atom bomb falls on some country tomorrow, it's because we argued with our neighbor today. The failure to forgive can have tragic and epic repercussions, for there's no telling as to how far things can escalate and how long bad blood and a bad spirit can fester when there's no attempt by ourselves and someone who's hurt us or someone we've hurt to reconcile what happened between us. Ninth reason as to why we need to be more forgiving is that the failure to do so can poison our character. According to the folklore of the Puma Indians, we have right next to our hearts a ball with spikes coming out of it, sitting right next to the heart. And according to the folklore, if we hurt someone or if we wrong someone, that ball begins to turn. And it'll keep turning and turning and turning till that dispute is settled, till that wrong is reconciled. And according to the legend, although those spikes never puncture or tear the heart, they do keep rubbing against it, causing a callus to form. So the longer the dispute, the longer things fester, the more calloused becomes the heart. Well, that's folklore, but it's really true. The failure to practice forgiveness, the failure to be more forgiving, can espouse bitterness, can make us surly, can make us harsh. And that will, of course, poison our character, poison our personality, and harden our hearts. Eighth reason why we need to be more forgiving is that the person who hurt us may have done so because they're hurting themselves. Just finished a terrific book. It's called The Barking to the Choir, written by Father Greg Boyle. His first book was Tattoos on the Heart, also a book well worth reading. Father Greg Boyle is a Jesuit priest who works in Los Angeles, in particular with the gangs there. He founded Homeboy Industries, which are different businesses where he hires these gang members to work there in the hopes that by doing so he can keep them from either killing themselves or landing up in jail. And he speaks in this particular book about the childhoods of some of the gang members he's gotten to know and meet. One particularly tore at my heart. He talked about a kid that used to go to school wearing three t-shirts. One to absorb all the blood from the beating he got from his parents before he left for school. The second because it would bleed through the first, the blood would bleed through the first t-shirt and infect the second. And the third because this way he had a white t-shirt on and no one would ask him about the blood. And that's just one story out of many. Stories of beatings and abandonment was the story of many a childhood, of many a gang member. And Boyle told those stories not to excuse the behavior of the gang members, but to help us to see how so much of their bad behavior comes from a childhood they never had, a childhood from hell. And it just makes you wonder about the people who may have hurt us. Maybe their childhood was like the childhood of those gang members. Maybe they are in constant pain from some illness that we don't know about. Maybe they are grieving horribly because someone they loved has died, or grieving terribly because something was taken away from them. Or maybe they're living in a house where domestic violence is rampant. We all need to realize that people sometimes do bad things because they've been hurt deeply by someone who's done bad things to them. Sometimes people do bad things because they know no other way to cope with the pain and the suffering going on within their lives. That's why we need to be more forgiving of the person who hurt us, because they may have done so because they're hurting themselves. Seventh reason why we need to be more forgiving is that the person who hurt us may have actually been helping us. Anaximenes, if I'm saying this right, old cynic philosopher, used to say, there are only two people who can tell us the truth. Our enemy, who hates us bitterly, or our friend, who loves us dearly. And so it may well be that the person who hurt us may have really been trying to bring to our attention a truth that maybe we didn't want to face. I always like that story of Sid and Barney, two old buddies, go out golfing one day. They've been friends for a long time. And they decide to put some skin in the game. How about if we play for $5? All right. They get to the 17th hole. Barney's ahead by a stroke, but he slices his approach to the green and it ends up in a rough. And very quickly he couldn't find the ball, so he called his buddy Sid over, help me to find my ball. And they all looked and looked and looked, and they couldn't find the ball. Now you have to know now a lost ball is a one-stroke penalty, which is going to make it a tie game. And of course, Barney looks over at Sid, and Sid's looking the other way, so he reaches into his pocket and pulls out another golf ball, throws it in the rough. Hey, I found my ball! Sid looks at him and says, you mean to tell me, after all these years of friendship, that you're going to cheat me? You're going to cheat over a measly $5? What do you mean cheat? I found my ball. How could you find your ball? I've been standing on it for the last 5 minutes. One of the problems with holding back on forgiveness is that quite often there's an air of self-righteousness about us. There's this idea that we are pure and pristine, that we're devoid of any sort of faults, that we never have done anything in need of forgiveness. Don't we sometimes think that way? I'm going to talk more about that tomorrow, by the way. Like Sid, we'll get mad and we'll resent a Barney, when in fact Barney had every reason and right to get mad and resent us. It could well be that Barney was doing us a favor in bringing to light the fact of our sinfulness. He hit us with a brutal truth that we just as soon not have to face. So we need to be forgiving, because the person who hurt us may in reality have helped us. Sixth reason why we need to be more forgiving is that otherwise we'll suffer the consequences that often come when we withhold that forgiveness. The story I've told a million times. It involves Rabbi Harold Kushner, who's probably my favorite author. Poor guy's getting too old now, but he's written about 8 books, all of which are very worthwhile reading, and I've read them all. He talked in one of the books about a woman that came to him one day, extremely livid and angry and bitter, because her ex-husband, who left her for a younger woman, was now coming up short on the child support payments. And she sat down in that chair across from him, and she went on blistering the man to no end. When she finally caught her breath, Rabbi Kushner said to her, you know, ma'am, you know what you ought to do? You ought to forgive your ex-husband. Forgive my ex-husband for all he's done to me and my children? He said, well, I'm not asking you to forgive him because what he did wasn't bad, it was reprehensible. I'm asking you to forgive him because he does not deserve to have the power to turn you into a bitter and a resentful woman. When we fail to forgive an ex-spouse or an ex-friend or anyone at all. We're giving them power over our sleep. We're giving them power over our nerves. We're giving them power over our peace of mind. And wouldn't they be delighted to know that our hatred of them is hurting us a lot more than it's hurting them. There are consequences to follow when we fail to be forgiving. And those consequences can be the erosion of our happiness and the fact of giving up our life to someone else. Fifth reason why we need to be more forgiving is that it can keep us from the embarrassment of having made a mistake. Before the advent of cell phones, woman's answering machine had a message that she was to call the school and call this teacher because of her son's wayward behavior. She didn't leave a phone number to call back, and she never mentioned the school. Well, the woman that got the message didn't have any kids. Teacher misdialed the call. Then there was another phone call someone received telling Bob that important meeting tomorrow is moved up to the morning hour, and he must be there because it's extremely important that everybody be on board. And the same thing as the other call, no number left to call back, no mention of the company. And the poor guy that had it on his answering machine was 80 years old. It wasn't Bob. Well, can you imagine the ramifications of that? Teacher thinking that lousy parent didn't even bother to call back. I guess he doesn't really care about how bad her kid is. Or how about Bob's boss? I thought Bob was a responsible man. How come he wasn't here today? Wrong judgments, as you can tell from that, they're easy to make. So it could well be that what we're mad about when it comes to someone else, the incident that's ruffled our feathers, it could be that it has no basis, either in fact or truth. It could be that we misinterpreted or wrongly judged a person's actions or lack of actions. And all our anger and all our resentment and all our hate has been directed towards someone who didn't deserve that anger, that resentment, or that hate to begin with. Fourth reason, as to why we need to be more forgiving. So it can be a source of great inspiration. Robert Coles, the famed sociologist, not sure if he's still alive or not. He was big many years ago. He was called upon to come to Montgomery, Alabama, because there was a young black girl there, no more than 7 years old. It was the first black girl to integrate an all-white school in Montgomery, Alabama, back in the early 60s. You can imagine that didn't go over there as well at all. As a matter of fact, the poor girl, her name was Ruby Bridges, by the way. Ruby Bridges had to be escorted into school every day by marshals. And every time she walked down the path into the school, there had to be the parents taunting her, yelling at her, "Go home, get out of here, we don't want you here," etc. So Coles was called in to help this little girl cope with all that yelling and screaming by the parents, to cope with what she was called upon to do. Well, when Coles got to meet Ruby Bridges, he couldn't believe it. The 7-year-old girl was unbelievably spirited, happy, didn't seem fazed at all. And yet she had to go and run the gauntlet every day. He said, "What do they need me? She's unbelievably a solid kid." So he decided to go and watch decided to go and watch as she would be escorted into school, escorted out. And he happened to notice that when she was walking back or walking in, and all these people are taunting her, he sees her lips moving. Oh, she must be shouting something back, probably. So when he sat down with her later that day, he said, you know, Ruby, I noticed when you're going into school and when you're coming out, and all those parents were yelling at you, I noticed you were yelling something back. He said, no, I wasn't. I wasn't yelling anything back. Sure you were. I saw your lips moving. Oh, I wasn't yelling. I was praying. What were you praying? I was praying, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they do. Wow! Can you imagine that? 7-year-old girl. Robert Cole said, I've been with the giants of the world. No one inspired me more than Ruby Bridges and her forgiving spirit. Third reason as to why we need to be more forgiving is that it may be our only means towards real peace. Leonardo da Vinci was painting the Last Supper. He became angry with a man, had it out with him, even threatened him. But then he had to come back and work on his painting. And he was painting at the time the face of Jesus, but he couldn't paint the face of Jesus because too much of that resentment and anger was percolating inside him. He knew he had to resolve all that. He found the man, begged his forgiveness. Then when he came back, he was able to paint the face of Jesus. When we wrong someone, someone wrongs us. Like Da Vinci, the anger and the resentment will percolate inside of us. Unless we find a way to forgive or be forgiven, unless we unload those bad feelings, we'll never secure true peace. Second reason, we're getting there, hang in there, almost done. Second reason as to why we need to be more forgiving is that we may otherwise end up making a mountain out of a molehill. There was a woman that used to give talks, and every time she completed a talk, she would pass out sheets of paper. She said, I want you to sign your name and write down a question. I'll do my best to try to answer them. So she had this stack of papers and began to answer the questions. All of a sudden, she came upon a sheet of paper where the person put idiot with arrows pointing after her. Well, it was interesting. She picked up that paper, obviously meant to insult her. She said, you know, I've been doing this a long time. And quite often, people will send up a question and they'll forget to sign their name. This is the first time someone signed their name and they forgot to ask the question. How often does it happen when we've gotten angry, resentful and bitter over someone or over something of an idiot nature, of an idiot quality? Someone or something that we should have never allowed to get under our skins. Far too many times, instead of forgiving a comment from a foolish source, instead of forgiving an incident that spoke of childishness, that spoke of immaturity, that spoke of vulgarity, we raise it, unfortunately, to a higher standard. We make the molehill a mountain. We invest a tremendous amount of negative energy in someone or something we should have forgiven for the simple reason that it or he or she was not worthy of our bother. And now, in case you've despaired that we'd ever get there, here's where Antoine does the drum roll. The number one reason why we need to be more forgiving is because God forgives us. John Killinger, a great preacher and author in his own right, was once asked the difference between the Old Testament and the New Testament. As he put it, in the Old Testament, God was seen as vindictive and vengeful. New Testament, God is seen as reconciling and forgiving and loving. And the interviewer asked him why God changed. And Killinger's response was a classic. He said, God's never changed at all. God was always loving and forgiving and reconciling. Jesus was sent, and the New Testament was written as a way for God to get rid of and correct a bad reputation. So God always forgives us. He's not into punishing sins. You know the sins carry their own punishment. He doesn't punish sins. He doesn't get mad at us for sinning, because he knows how much the sin hurts us. So the least we can do with a God so generous with forgiveness is our being forgiving of others. Well, there you have it. Top 10 reasons as to why we need to be more forgiving. I'd repeat them again, but we want to get home before midnight. It all gives, of course, testimony to the gospel passage we heard that we need to forgive 7 times, 7 times, 7 times, which means forever. Suffice it to say, you're not very forgiving. It's time you changed. It's time you became more forgiving. Maybe, just maybe, you need to see one of the confessors tonight for your failure to be more forgiving.